Hello, my name's David Bruce. So, music versus pattern. How much is music just pattern? We all know that music has some kind of relationship to pattern, but it's when we visualize the music we can see those patterns most clearly. Now, if you use digital audio workstations, you'll be familiar with seeing the patterns of your music at two different levels. At the zoomed out level, we see the patterns of the repeating structures, the cycle of the drum track, the repeating chorus and verse sections. But then there's also the zoomed in patterns you can see in a MIDI track, individual notes and the degree to which they repeat and form patterns. But the same can be said for printed scores. Composers like Chopin and Bach seem particularly susceptible to patterns, and the patterns in their music are often visible just by looking at the score itself. Again, you can see the patterns at a zoomed out level, like here in various Chopin etudes collected by Douglas R. Hofstadter, each of which seems to have a distinctive pattern on the page, or zoomed in, like in this representation of individual notes in Chopin's Opus 25, number 11. As Hofstadter notes, the piece is composed of two alternating and utterly different components. The odd-numbered notes, in red here, trace out a perfect descending chromatic scale for 4 octaves, while the even-numbered notes, in blue, wedge between them like pickets in the spaces in a picket fence, and dictate an arpeggio with repeated notes. This kind of visualization of music has been taken further by people like Stephen Malinowski, who was one of the first to create computer software to turn the pitches instruments play into animated patterns.
This is a new form of music notation called music animation. It operates on an IBM-compatible computer. When virtually any kind of music is played back through the machine, it appears on a television screen as a field of dashes. The longer the note, the longer the dash. The higher the note, the higher the dash. The faster the tempo, the faster it all scrolls by.
Here's that same Chopin piece, this time with Malinowski's visualization. And you can even take it further than that into what's sometimes called visual music. Here, for example, Liz Rhodes creates a film where the visual image and the sound are generated literally from the same source. The patterns on the screen map precisely to the patterns we hear. For some, this represents an entirely new and underexplored continent of artistic expression. Now, in the case of Malinowski, most of his videos animate masterpieces of the classical music tradition, and the patterns he creates are so beautiful, surely that confirms all music is pattern. It's certainly a tempting proposition, and it's one that has lured many scientists and programmers to try to get a computer to generate convincing music. They often start by imitating those most obviously pattern composers like Bach, but the results are, well, never fully convincing. Some kinds of music, though, are entirely or almost entirely pattern. This is a music box, and like those MIDI notes in a digital audio device, each notch on the barrel sounds a note on the corresponding metal strips as it passes under it. So the pattern on the box is directly responsible for the notes we hear. People have always been fascinated by musical machines like this. It sounds so sweet and charming, and yet all it is a barrel with some notches on and a crank of the little handle. But the instruments in this place take that music box idea to a whole nother level. Instead of the notches on the music box, all these mechanical instruments use a hole-punched roll to create music. So again, patterns turn directly into sound. What I think we find fascinating here is how close these things are to real music. We think of music as the most human, the most expressive of art forms, and yet these machines manage to produce something, well, pretty close to the real thing. And yet it's not quite real music, is it? It's notable that most of these mechanical instruments were designed essentially to be background music. The mechanical violin and piano was apparently used in restaurants and had the added bonus for the restaurateur that they could still collect tips for the music without having to pay the musician. But But in truth, I don't think many of us would sit down in our living rooms and put this stuff on purely to enjoy it, purely to listen to it. But what about this? It's hard to imagine a sound world more different to the bustle of those mechanical instruments. Brian Eno's music for airports was one of the first examples of what became known as the genre of ambient music. But this is also pure pattern, created here by layering tapes of differing lengths over each other to create a constantly changing but mechanically produced pattern. Like the mechanical music, the intention is to create something that functions like a background wash, allowing you to tune out rather than something you actively listen to. Eno said he wanted it to be as ignorable as it is interesting. And interestingly, this ignorability can still work even if the patterns are more complex. Some ambient artists mimic the complexity of sounds in the real world, the complex rush of white noise when a wave crashes on the shore, for example. Or here in Andrew Huang's recent fireworks sound art, where the position of exploding fireworks in a video clip triggers complex ambient noises in the synthesizer. For a brief period in classical music history, some composers pushed pure pattern to its most extreme. The idea of serialism, pioneered by Arnold Schoenberg, was a sort of equal rights movement for notes, where each of the 12 chromatic notes had to be sounded in turn before any of them could be repeated. These 12 notes could then be turned upside down, the inversion, played backwards, the retrograde, or both together, the retrograde inversion, but still preserving this note equality. So even if it's not always audible as such, it's clearly quite a patterned kind of music. And as a system, it's proved flexible enough to allow for a large range of styles, from Berg's expressionistic operas through to the delicate poetry of Della Piccola's Quaderno Musical di Anna Libera. But shortly after the Second World War, composers like Messiaen, Boulez and Stockhausen all attempted to serialize other aspects of music, the rhythms and even the dynamics. Messiaen and Boulez both wrote piano pieces in this style, which became known as total serialism. And Stockhausen's Study No. 2 took the idea into the electronic world. The serial approach here was even used to generate the timbre of the tones themselves. Interestingly, the patterns created in this piece are clear in the score itself. But to me, this is music in which the pattern has taken over. All these pieces represented something of a dead end for music rather than the fresh start the composers hoped for. It was perhaps an interesting experiment to try, but it felt like the balance between the pattern and the human had got out of hand. And this really is the point I wanted to make here. Pattern is undoubtedly a large and important part of music, but the closer you get to pure pattern, the more robotic, or at least the less human, it feels. I've noticed this in quite a fine-grained way as my own approach to composing has changed. When I wrote my violin concerto Fragile Light, I included for the first time a kind of harmonic process which allowed the music to shift tonal centre, so at the end of a particular melodic line it arrived somewhere new. So the music had this feeling of constantly restarting. It was my first tentative embracing of a patterned approach to composing, and quite a modest one at that. But it was fascinating to me that one review really picked up on this, and under the title of Nobody Home in Bruce's New Work, the review said it was like watching a play with brilliantly rendered evocative scenery, but there's nobody on stage. Instead, the work came across as a rather cold study in colour and texture. Now, I'm not going to start arguing with reviewers, but I did find it fascinating that as soon as I even did a taste of genuine pattern in my work, I started getting people finding the music less human. Of course, we can also take things too far the other way. Around the same time as those total serial pieces, John Cage was writing his Music of Changes. I say writing, but he was actually using chants based on the Chinese I Ching to dictate the score. So you could say this is the total removal of pattern. Now, what has struck many people is how similar these two apparently polar opposite approaches end up sounding. This is Stockhausen's Klavierstück III, the completely patterned. And this is Cage's Music of Changes, the completely patternless. So there's a long scale from no pattern to completely patterned, and it seems that most of the music we actually want to sit down and listen to lies somewhere along this scale, perhaps somewhere away from the extremes of either end, balancing the patterned and the non-patterned. We need our patterns to have that soul, that inner life, that sense of humanity. So music, you could say, is pattern modified by humanity. So thank you very much to all of you who have watched, commented and subscribed. It's great to see the channel pass 50,000 the other day. I'm planning on having a big party if I ever make it to 100,000, so halfway there. If you're keen to see the channel continue to flourish, do consider joining my patrons over at Patreon, and I'm really grateful to everyone who's already signed up. I hope you enjoyed this video on patterns and that it gave you something to think about in your own music making. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time.